For nearly 20 years, nobody crossed the gate of the house at the end of Mercer Road. Children walked faster when they passed it. Neighbors kept their curtains shut after dark. And even the men who claimed to fear nothing avoided looking at its windows for too long. Slow pause. The strange part was not the decay. Every town has abandoned places. It was the silence. The kind of silence that makes a person hear their own thoughts too clearly. Soft piano continues. The philosopher Nietzsche once wrote, "When you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." And for years, people believed that house had been staring back at them. Fog rolling across the road, boards creaking softly. A dim porch light flickering, no visitors, no owners, no movement, just a collapsing structure, sitting like a memory nobody wanted to touch. Then in the middle of winter, a black truck appeared just before sunrise. And a man nobody recognized stepped out carrying only 2 bags. No family, no conversation, no explanation. He paid cash for the house 3 hours later, and by nightfall he was inside. The neighbors watched from behind their windows, trying to understand one thing. Why would someone willingly move into a place everybody else spent 20 years avoiding? But the real question was who he had become before he ever arrived there. Slow ambient sound rises. Machiavelli once warned that a man who has lost everything no longer fears consequences. And there was something unsettling about the way he walked through that front gate. Like someone who had already made peace with ruin. Visual. Dust floating through broken windows. Some men run from pain, others learn to live inside it. And this man looked like he had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. Wind through empty hallway. One neighbor later said, "It wasn't the house that disturbed me, it was how comfortable he seemed inside it." Days passed, then weeks. No lights, no visitors, no sound except hammering late at night. And every morning, the same man stood alone in the yard staring at the broken structure as if he were trying to rebuild something far greater than walls. Soft piano deepens. Because sometimes, people do not search for abandoned places to hide from the world. They search for places that resemble what they feel inside. But what happened months later would pull strangers from across the city before sunrise. Cars lined up outside the house every morning. People waited quietly near the front steps, and nobody could understand why. How does a place everyone feared become the one place people refuse to stay away from? That answer begins long before the house. It begins with the kind of loneliness most people hide from the world. Before the house, there was already a collapse happening inside him. At first, nobody noticed it, because men like him become experts at performing normality. He still answered emails. He still nodded during conversations. He still said, "I'm fine," with the same exhausted smile. But every night, when the apartment door closed, another part of him disappeared. Heated meals in plastic containers. A television glowing in an empty room. Stacks of unopened bills beside the sink. The sound of a microwave became more familiar to him than another human voice. A strange thing happens to a man after enough disappointment. He stops speaking about the future. Years earlier, he had been different, disciplined, focused. The kind of man people expected success from. He built a career before 30. He worked longer than everyone else. He sacrificed sleep. He sacrificed relationships, and believed suffering always led somewhere meaningful. But suffering without meaning changes a person. He lost his marriage slowly. No screaming, no dramatic ending, just distance. 2 people becoming strangers while pretending everything was still repairable. The frightening part about loneliness is not silence. It's how quickly silence starts feeling normal. He stopped answering calls. He ignored messages for weeks. He avoided friends because pretending to be okay became exhausting. And over time, his existence became reduced to routines. Wake up. Work, return home, sit in darkness, repeat. Psychologists often speak about visible breakdowns, but the dangerous ones happen quietly. No shouting, no warnings. Just a gradual separation between a man and the person he used to be. At 2:14 in the morning, he would sit beside the window watching strangers walk below his apartment. Laughing, arguing, living. And he began feeling like he was observing humanity instead of belonging to it. Nietzsche once wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how," but eventually, he lost his why. And after that, even ordinary mornings began feeling heavy. He no longer felt important enough to be remembered. One neighbor from his old apartment later said, "I used to hear him walking around at night, back and forth, for hours. Like he was trying to outrun something inside his own mind. He walked for miles those most nights. No destination, just movement. Because stopping meant thinking. And thinking had become dangerous. Then one night, during one of those walks, he saw the house for the first time. A dead property at the end of Mercer Road, broken windows, a collapsed porch, trees hanging over the roof like they were hiding it from the world. And according to the few people he later spoke to, he stood outside the gate for nearly an hour without moving. Most people saw decay. He saw familiarity, the abandoned walls, the emptiness, the feeling that something inside had been left untouched for too long. And from that moment, he could not stop thinking about it. Every night after work, he returned to the street, sometimes standing across from the property in complete silence, sometimes walking slowly around the fence, sometimes staring at the upper windows, as if expecting someone to appear. Machiavelli once warned that isolation changes the structure of a man's thinking, and prolonged loneliness can make destruction feel comforting. He began sleeping less, eating less, speaking less. The house consumed his thoughts in ways he could not explain. And there was one thing: he never told anyone about the house. The first night he saw it, he could have sworn someone was already standing inside. The house sat at the end of Mercer Road like a memory the town wanted erased. Overgrown grass swallowed the front steps. The porch had collapsed years earlier. One side of the roof sagged inward like the structure itself had grown tired of standing. Even during daylight, the place felt dim. Neighbors avoided looking directly at it. Delivery drivers refused to stop near the gate after sunset. And children dared each other to touch the fence before running away. For nearly 2 decades, the house survived entirely through rumor. Some believed the former owner vanished inside it. Others claimed strange noises came from the upper floor late at night. Floorboards moving, voices traveling through empty rooms. A woman across the street once told police she saw lights moving through the windows during a year when the electricity had already been cut off. No evidence was ever found, but fear does not need evidence to survive. It only needs repetition. Over time, the stories became part of the town itself. People stopped asking what was true. They only knew the feeling the house gave them. One retired mechanic who grew up nearby later said, "The place didn't feel dead. It felt like something was waiting." The strange part was not the condition of the property. It was the emotional weight surrounding it. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt emotionally abandoned. The walls carried the atmosphere of years without warmth. Dust covered every room. Mold climbed the ceilings. Water stains stretched across the wallpaper like dark veins. And inside the hallway, old newspaper clippings had been nailed directly into the walls. Missing persons, foreclosures, funeral announcements, stories about lives quietly falling apart. No one understood why he bought the place. The town assumed he was unstable or desperate. Maybe both, because nobody willingly chooses isolation unless isolation already exists inside them. Machiavelli once wrote that men are driven more by fear than reason, and the house had become a monument to fear. But when he looked at it, he did not see danger. He saw reflection. People later claimed he walked through the property for hours before signing the papers. No flashlight, no hesitation, just silence. As if he belonged there already. The truth was, he didn't buy the house because he had hope. He bought it because he had nowhere left to go emotionally. Some people don't look for a new beginning. They just look for somewhere to disappear quietly. And in a strange way, the house understood that feeling. The first time he stepped inside, the air smelled like wet wood and decay. The floor groaned beneath every step. Wind moved through cracks in the walls like whispers traveling room to room. He found broken furniture covered in sheets, family photographs left behind, a dining table still set with plates, as if life had stopped in the middle of a sentence. Most men would have left immediately. He stayed, and the more time he spent inside, the more the outside world seemed distant. Neighbors began noticing lights moving through the windows after midnight. The sound of hammering, dragging chains. Long periods of silence followed by sudden movement. And each morning, he looked more exhausted than the day before. One neighbor claimed he saw the man standing motionless in the upstairs window before sunrise, watching the street, watching nothing. Nietzsche believed that prolonged isolation forces a man to confront himself without distraction. But sometimes, when a person enters enough darkness, they begin finding comfort there. And there was something about the house that slowly changed the way he carried himself. Less fear, less emotion, like the building was stripping something out of him piece by piece. But the first night inside the house changed something in him forever. The first night inside the house, the silence felt different, not peaceful, not calming, heavy. The kind of silence that forces a man to hear everything he spent years trying to outrun. Rain leaked steadily through the damaged roof. Water tapped against the floorboards somewhere deep inside the hallway. Wind moved through broken windows with a low, hollow sound. And as darkness filled the rooms, the house seemed larger than it looked from outside. He had no furniture, no bed, no electricity. Only a flashlight beside him on the floor. And sometime after midnight, even the flashlight began losing power. The beam grew weaker. The shadows stretched longer. The rooms around him disappeared inch by inch into darkness. For the first time in years, there was no distraction left. No television, no music, no conversation, no pretending, just him. And men often fear silence for one reason. Silence removes performance. Machiavelli once warned that every man eventually reveals his true nature when stripped of comfort. And that night, comfort no longer existed. He lay awake staring into the darkness above him, listening to the rain, to the old wood cracking inside the walls, to his own breathing, and eventually to his own thoughts. The memories came slowly at first, his failed marriage, the words he never said, the calls he ignored, the version of himself he abandoned years earlier while chasing success. Then came the realization he spent years avoiding. No one was coming to save him. Nietzsche believed that when a man suffers long enough, he either recreates himself or disappears into bitterness. And somewhere around 3 a.m, he understood how close he had come to disappearing. He began crying quietly in the dark, not out of weakness, but exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that builds after years of carrying disappointment without speaking about it. One hand covering his face, rain falling through the ceiling nearby, the house completely silent around him. And in that moment, the abandoned house no longer felt frightening. It felt honest, because for the first time in years, the condition of the building matched the condition of the man inside it. Sometimes silence forces you to meet the version of yourself you spent years avoiding. And that encounter is not always survivable. Hours passed before he finally stood up. He walked through the darkness using the fading flashlight, room after room, dust, broken glass, rotting furniture, until he noticed a narrow wooden door near the back of the house. A workshop, small, forgotten, covered in years of dust. Old tools hung from the walls, hammers, rust-covered saws, jars filled with nails. A workbench buried beneath debris, and above the bench, written directly onto the wall in faded black ink, were words that stopped him. Cold. If a thing can be rebuilt, maybe we were too. He stared at the sentence for a long time, as if the house itself had answered something he never asked out loud. One former monk once wrote, "A broken man does not need advice first. He needs evidence that restoration is possible," and standing alone inside that workshop, for the first time in years, he felt something. Unfamiliar, not happiness, not relief, something quieter, possibility. But by morning, the house would give him another reason to question whether he truly understood what he had stepped into. The next morning, he began tearing the house apart, not because he knew how to fix it, but because destruction was the only language he understood anymore. He ripped mold from the walls with bleeding hands. He dragged broken furniture into the yard alone. He swept years of dust from rooms nobody had entered in decades. And with every layer removed from the house, something hidden inside him began surfacing too. The strange thing about rebuilding is that it forces a man into confrontation with his habits, with his excuses, with the person he became while nobody was watching. He woke before sunrise every day, worked until his shoulders trembled, spent nights eating canned food on the floor beside buckets catching rainwater from the ceiling. The house fought him constantly. Floorboards collapsed, pipes burst. The electricity failed repeatedly. One afternoon, part of the staircase gave way beneath him. He hit the ground hard enough to fracture 2 ribs, but he kept working, because pain had stopped feeling unusual to him years earlier. Nietzsche once wrote, "What does not destroy me makes me stronger." But people rarely quote the hidden truth behind that idea. Survival changes a person, and not always gently. The more he repaired the house, the more isolated he became from the outside world. He ignored calls. He stopped checking messages completely. Days passed without conversation. The only sounds inside the property became hammers, breathing, and old wood straining beneath movement. One neighbor later admitted, "I used to see him standing in the yard after midnight, completely still, like he was listening to the house." And in many ways, he was, because the house had begun revealing things to him. Not supernatural things, human things. Old photographs hidden beneath floorboards, children's drawings inside closets. Bills from families who once tried holding their lives together inside those rooms. The evidence of ordinary people slowly collapsing under invisible weight. And each discovery forced him to confront a truth about himself. Most broken lives do not collapse all at once. They decay quietly, one ignored habit at a time, one avoided conversation at a time, one lonely night at a time. Machiavelli believed men become dangerous when they lose purpose. But a man without purpose can also become dangerous to himself. And there were nights. He came close to giving up entirely. One evening during heavy rain, he suffered his first panic attack in years. He could not breathe. His hands shook violently. He collapsed against the unfinished wall, gasping for air while thunder echoed through the house. And for several minutes, he truly believed he was dying. But the terrifying part was this. A small part of him did not care. Because hopelessness eventually numbs fear, and numb men make reckless decisions. Most people think transformation feels inspiring. Usually, it feels lonely. It feels like doubting yourself in silence. It feels like exhaustion nobody applauds. It feels like rebuilding something every day, while secretly wondering if the damage is permanent. And one night, he finally decided to leave. He loaded his tools into the truck, packed his remaining clothes, started the engine. The rain fell hard against the windshield, and for several seconds, he stared at the house without moving. The windows were no longer covered in dirt. The front porch had been rebuilt. One room inside glowed with warm light. For the first time in decades, the house looked alive again. And something disturbed him about that realization. Because for the first time in years, so did he. He shut the engine off, sat there in silence, then slowly stepped out of the truck. One philosopher once wrote, "A man is reborn the moment he chooses responsibility over escape." And that night, he walked back inside. The following weeks changed everything. The grass outside was cut. The broken fence disappeared. Warm light began shining through the windows each evening. And eventually, the neighbors started noticing. At first, they only watched from a distance. But what happened after the town noticed the changes surprised everyone. At first, the neighbors only watched. They watched from porches, from behind curtains, from parked cars moving slowly past the property. Because people become curious when something they feared begins changing. The dead grass disappeared first, then the broken fence. The front windows were cleaned, and one morning, for the first time in nearly 20 years, sunlight passed completely through the house. The street noticed. Children riding bicycles began slowing down near the gate. People walking dogs stopped pretending not to look. And for reasons nobody fully understood, the fear surrounding the property slowly began fading. Not all at once, quietly. The same way winter disappears. One cold morning, an elderly man from across the street walked toward the house carrying 2 cups of coffee. He stood near the gate awkwardly for several seconds before speaking. "Figured you could use something warm." The man stared at him carefully, as if he had forgotten how ordinary kindness sounded. Because isolation changes people. When a person spends enough time alone, even simple compassion begins feeling unfamiliar. The older neighbor introduced himself, spoke briefly about the weather, the repairs, the history of the neighborhood, and before leaving, he said something unexpected. "Good seeing lights in that house again." That sentence stayed with him longer than it should have, because nobody had spoken to him without obligation in a very long time. No transaction, no expectation, just humanity. Machiavelli once observed that most men are moved more deeply by appearances than truth. But sometimes, small acts reveal truths appearances cannot hide. And the truth was, people were beginning to recognize something inside. Him, not confidence, not success, effort. The visible struggle of a man trying to rebuild himself without saying it out loud. Soon after, others began stopping by. A woman asked if he needed spare tools. One neighbor offered old lumber from his garage. Another simply stood outside discussing repair techniques for nearly an hour. No one mentioned the rumors anymore. No one spoke about the fear surrounding the property. Because something stronger had entered the street. Hope. And hope spreads quietly, especially among people carrying private pain. People weren't responding to the house. They were responding to what it represented. A second chance. Proof that ruin is not always permanent. Nietzsche believed human beings suffer deeply because they crave meaning. And watching that house slowly return to life gave the neighborhood something many of them did not realize they needed. A reminder that broken things can still be rebuilt. One afternoon, while repairing the front steps, he heard laughter from nearby. Children had stopped their bikes outside the fence watching him work. One of them asked if the house was still haunted. For the first time, he laughed, a small laugh, tired, quiet, but real. And then something happened that nobody on Mercer Road had seen from him before. He smiled, not the forced smile people use to survive conversations, a genuine one, brief, almost uncertain, as if he was remembering what it felt like. And in that moment, the house no longer looked abandoned. Neither did he. At first, a few people visited, a retired mechanic, a widower from 2 streets over, a young man recently fired from his job who admitted he had nowhere else to go during the day. They arrived quietly, usually carrying coffee, sometimes tools, sometimes nothing at all except exhaustion, and without planning it. The house slowly became something unexpected. The old workshop in the back room was cleaned first. He repaired the workbench, organized the rusted tools, rebuilt the shelves. And every evening, someone else showed up asking if they could help. One man wanted to learn woodworking. Another simply needed somewhere to escape his apartment after a divorce. One arrived after losing his father, another after losing himself. And inside that old abandoned house, men who spent years pretending they were fine finally stopped pretending. They repaired chairs. They rebuilt cabinets. They shared meals in silence. Sometimes they spoke for hours. Sometimes nobody spoke at all. But strangely, everyone understood each other, because pain recognizes pain. One philosopher once said, "Every man has 2 lives. The second begins when he realizes he only has one." And many of the men entering that workshop looked like they had reached that realization. Recently, word spread slowly through the city, not through advertisements, not through social media, but through conversations people have when something changes them deeply. "There's a place you should see. There's a man helping people over on Mercer Road. It's hard to explain." Then the mornings began changing. Cars appeared before sunrise. 1, then 3, then 10, pickup trucks, old sedans. Men sitting quietly inside vehicles holding coffee cups before walking toward house. The same house people once crossed the street to avoid had become the one place strangers willingly drove across the city to enter. Sunlight now poured through windows once covered in dust. The sound of hammers echoed through rooms that had spent years in silence. Laughter replaced fear. Conversations replaced rumors, and every morning more cars lined up outside. The house people feared for decades became the one place people finally felt understood. Machiavelli believed most men spend their lives hiding weakness, because the world punishes vulnerability. But inside those walls, men spoke honestly, about addiction, about failure, about panic attacks, about divorce, about nights they almost gave up. And something powerful happened when honesty entered that house. The shame began disappearing. Pain that heals correctly often becomes shelter for other people. One morning, a man in his 40s arrived carrying a small toolbox. He barely spoke during his first week. He worked quietly, avoided eye contact, always left before everyone else. Then one evening, after the others had gone home, he stood beside the doorway looking around the workshop, at the repaired walls, at the warm lights, at the men laughing quietly near the workbench. And with tears in his eyes, he said something nobody in that room forgot. "This place saved my life." The room fell silent, and the owner of the house stood there without speaking, because only months earlier, he had entered that same building with nothing left, inside himself except exhaustion. And now the very place he once used to escape the world had become the reason other people wanted to keep living in it. By the end of winter, people stopped referring to it as the abandoned house. They simply called it Mercer House. And somehow, that felt important, because names change when meaning changes. Nobody lined up outside because the house was beautiful. They came because it reminded them that broken things aren't always beyond repair. The walls still carried scars, the floors still creaked. Some parts of the ceiling remained unfinished, but maybe that was the reason people trusted the place. It never pretended to be perfect, and neither did the people inside it. Old photographs of the property sat near the workshop entrance. Collapsed rooms, boarded windows, rotting walls covered in dust, and beside those photographs stood the present version of the house, warm lights, coffee brewing before sunrise, and laughing beside repaired tables, conversations replacing silence. The transformation felt larger than construction. It felt human, because the house had become a reflection of something society rarely speaks honestly about: modern loneliness, the quiet epidemic nobody notices until it reaches someone they love. Millions of people surrounded by noise, yet emotionally starving. Connected to everyone digitally, while feeling understood by no one. Personally, Machiavelli observed that people carefully protect the image they present to the world. And modern life has perfected that performance. Men smiling through depression, families hiding emotional distance, people collapsing internally while appearing functional externally. And over time, many begin believing they must suffer privately to remain, accepted publicly. But inside Mercer House, that performance disappeared. No status, no pretending, no pressure to appear strong every second. Only honesty. And honesty is rare enough now to feel revolutionary. One visitor later explained it best. Nobody came here because they needed tools. They came because this was one of the few places left where people actually listened. That sentence explained everything. Because human beings can survive hardship. They can survive failure. They can survive loss. But what destroys many people is feeling invisible while experiencing it. Nietzsche believed that every person carries hidden chaos inside them. But he also believed something else. One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. And maybe that was the real meaning behind the house. The damage never fully disappeared. The scars remained visible, but the ruin no longer defined it. It became proof that restoration is possible even after collapse, room by room, habit by habit, conversation by conversation. The abandoned house mirrored the people inside it, bruised, tired, imperfect, but still standing. And every morning, as cars lined quietly along Mercer Road before sunrise, the neighborhood witnessed something they never expected to see. Again, life returning to a place everyone once gave up on. Every morning before sunrise, the same ritual began. Headlights appeared slowly along Mercer Road, one car, then another, doors opening quietly in the cold, men carrying coffee cups toward the warm light inside the house, and at exactly 6 each morning, he unlocked the front door himself. The same door people once feared touching, the same hallway once buried beneath silence and decay, now filled with voices, with movement, with life. And sometimes, he would stand still for a moment before everyone arrived, looking around the house quietly, at the repaired walls, at the workshop, at the photographs still hanging near the entrance. Evidence of what the place used to be, and evidence of what it became. One philosopher wrote, "The strongest men are not those who avoid darkness. They are the ones who carry light into it." And maybe that was the real story of Mercer House. Not construction, not restoration. Redemption. Because long before the house was rebuilt, a broken man walked through its doors believing his life no longer mattered. He arrived emotionally exhausted, disconnected from the world, disconnected from himself, and like many people suffering quietly, he believed isolation was safer than vulnerability. But pain kept in darkness eventually consumes the person carrying it. Machiavelli warned that a man without purpose becomes vulnerable to despair, and despair is dangerous because it convinces people nothing can change. But something did change, slowly, painfully, one wall at a time. One conversation at a time, one honest morning at a time. The abandoned house became proof that healing does not always begin with answers. Sometimes it begins with responsibility, with showing up, with refusing to leave the ruins of your life untouched. In the end, the abandoned house didn't become famous because someone restored it. It became meaningful because someone who felt emotionally abandoned chose not to give up. And perhaps that is why people kept returning. Not for the building, but for the reminder that failure is not final, that loneliness does not have to become identity, that even damaged people can create shelter for others. Nietzsche once wrote, "To live is to suffer. To survive is to find meaning in the suffering." And inside that old house, many people finally did. Maybe that's what healing really is. Not erasing the damage, not pretending the pain never existed, but turning the place that once broke you into a place where others can finally feel whole. And as morning light slowly filled Mercer Road, the house stood quietly in the distance, no longer feared, no longer abandoned, just alive. If this story connected with something deep inside you, if some part of your life feels heavy right now, if you have been fighting silent battles nobody around you fully understands, then you are not alone. Through Silent Storms was created for people carrying invisible weight, for people rebuilding themselves quietly, for people trying to find meaning after pain. Every story on this channel is a reminder that even in isolation, even after failure, even after emotional collapse, a person can still rise again. So if stories like this speak to you, if they help you think differently, if they remind you to keep going when life becomes difficult, then subscribe to Through Silent Storms. Because there are millions of people suffering silently. And sometimes one story, one message, or one moment of understanding can change the direction of someone's life. Like the video, share it with someone who may need it. And remember, some storms do not arrive to destroy you. They arrive to rebuild you into someone stronger.